With the North American WCQ right around the corner, a lot of players are trying to tech out their decks with different traps. Well, I've got 5 of those traps that you should look out for, as well as ways to play around them. Cimoooooooo! What's going on, guys? It's Cimo. So today I'm bringing to you a discussion on 5 trap cards you can avoid playing into at the North American WCQ. Now this video is probably going to be primarily catered to all of the people playing the meta decks, but if you're playing non-meta decks, you should expect a lot of the players that are, really serious about winning the event to possibly be playing some of the cards on this list. So whether you're playing Zodiac, True Draco Zodiac, Pure True Draco, True King Yang Zing Dinosaurs, or really anything, this is going to be an excellent video for you to utilize as a resource to kind of know what some of the hot traps are going into the format. Now, we're not going to be discussing Dimensional Barrier, Solemn Strike, or Solemn Warning, because those are pretty much the most obvious trap cards that pretty much every deck is playing for the most part in some form or another. We're going to be talking about more of the low-key trap cards that some players might be teching out whether in their main deck or might have allocated to the side deck. So starting off with our first trap card, it's Forbidden Apocrypha. Now Forbidden Apocrypha is probably the most popular card out of the 5 on this list, but I feel it's definitely worth mentioning for several different reasons. So basically how the card works is that if there are 2 or more monsters of a specific type, mainly being Xyz, but also can apply to Synchro and other card types as well, you declare that type, and then all monsters of that type on both players' fields are sent to the graveyard. Now this is very important because the word sent means it's not destroyed, meaning it plays around a very popular card like My Body as a Shield, which is pretty much being played in play sets in most players' decks, which is why some people have kind of gone over to the Forbidden Apocrypha hype train, and it's a pretty solid card for that reason. The fact that it doesn't destroy means it's not like Torrential Tribute, although it kind of serves the same function, but it actually can't be, stopped by My Body as a Shield. So if you play into it, especially if, you're the player using Forbidden Apocrypha and your opponent has all the monsters, as the player using the trap, you're going to gain all of the value. But there are several ways you can play around it. First off, just don't overextend and have several monsters of a specific type, mainly being, like I said, Xyz monsters, on the field at any given time, because Apocrypha does require 2 to be activated, so as long as you just have 1 Xyz monster or 1 Synchro monster or anything like that, you're totally fine, and they're just gonna have a dead card sitting in their back row. Second off, another interesting thing about Forbidden Apocrypha is that to activate the Forbidden Apocrypha, there needs to be the 2 or more monsters rather on the field, but at resolution, if there are no longer 2 monsters of that type on the field, Forbidden Apocrypha actually fizzles out, and you actually get to keep the monster. So hypothetically, if you have a Zodiac Trident and another Xyz monster on the board, if your opponent flips Forbidden Apocrypha, you can chain your Trident's effect to pop your other Xyz monster, and then Forbidden Apocrypha will actually fizzle, and you get to keep your Zodiac Trident. Now, I know you're still going to be taking a bit of a minus by doing that, but you are keeping your Trident on the board, so if you have something like a Whiptail you can throw under it, then it's still going to be live for your opponent's next turn, and it's something that they still have to deal with. So that's a really cool trick you can use, and I know I just used Trident just as an example, but as long as you have cards that can pretty much function in a similar manner to clear monsters off your board, then it's a very good way to play around Forbidden Apocrypha. Now for number 2, we have another card that's kind of like a massive board removal in a sense, and that card is Needle Sealing. Now Needle Sealing has been seeing a little bit of resurgence, and Needle Sealing is such a funny card because it always pops in and out of formats when there's a very super special summon spam heavy format, and then funny enough it makes its way in, but it has to make its way in when there's monsters that don't really gain value when they hit the graveyard, or if you're the player playing a deck that does gain value off of that, Needle Sealing is a very appealing option. So Needle Sealing reads, if there are 4 or more monsters on the field, destroy all face-up monsters. Now this is really interesting because, again, it's kind of like Torrential Tribute as long as there's 4 or more monsters on the field, but it does have a little bit of a heavy stipulation because there does need to be 4 monsters. And 4, while it doesn't seem like a lot, also is a lot in a sense as well. And one of the easiest ways to play around this card is just don't go over 4 monsters. You know, you could just make 3 monsters on your field, and then you're fairly safe. But honestly, going 2 is probably the best option, and the reason I say that is because during your opponent's turn, if you have 3 monsters on your board, all they need to do is summon 1 monster, and then they can just needle sealing you, and then you're gonna lose all your monsters, and they got a lot of value off of that 1 needle sealing. Another thing is needle sealing does destroy, so, you know, My Body as a Shield is still a viable option in this case. Obviously, you're gonna want to be saving My Body as a Shield for other things like Tridents, Ghost Ogres, and really anything else, but the thing is, people might not be expecting needle sealing, so you might want to hang on to that My Body as a Shield just as a lifeline in case you really want to protect your board. Now, another interesting thing to note about needle sealing is that it only destroys face-up monsters. So if you have a card like Book of Moon, for example, you could chain it in response to the activation of needle sealing, flip one of your monsters face down if you really want to protect it, and that monster actually won't be destroyed because it's face down on the field. Another way as well is that if you just set monsters to your field, if it triggers the needle sealing, you're going to keep any of your set monsters as well, so it's just another cool way to help you play around that card. So for number 3, we have Anti-Spell Fragrance, and also by extension Imperial Order, because both of these cards essentially do the same thing, just in different ways, but I wanted to kind of couple them together. Now, Anti-Spell Fragrance, while it's not being seen in heavy use in the main deck, it's definitely being seen in the side deck, and the purpose of Anti-Spell Fragrance as well as Imperial Order is to just completely lock you out of your spell cards, and that's very important because if your opponent goes first in game 2 and you're going second, more likely than not, you're going to be siding a lot of spell cards in because you don't want your trap cards going second. This makes Anti-Spell Fragrance a very appealing option in the side deck because it can pretty much shut down, you know, 50% if not more of your opponent's deck because it's pretty much primarily comprised of spell cards. Same goes for Imperial Order. So one of the best ways to really deal with this is to side in as much spell and trap removal as you possibly can. And the reason for that is because most players are going to flip Anti-Spell Fragrance immediately on your standby phase after their turn concludes. So you need to have the out to this because if you don't, you're not going to have any way to play any of your spell cards. So if you have the feeling that you're going to be seeing a lot of Anti-Spell Fragrance or Imperial Order, you're going to want to side as many copies as Twin Twister and Cosmic Cyclone as you possibly have in your side and main deck combined, because having those is going to increase your chances of being able to out the Anti-Spell Fragrance. Just think about it. They can only have 3 copies of Anti-Spell Fragrance at the max, whereas you could run 3 Twin Twister as well as 3 Cosmic Cyclone if you really feel like going that balls deep. So you have a much higher chance in that instance to be able to out the Anti-Spell Fragrance, which is very important. You're also going to be drawing to 6 cards, which actually can really matter in terms of the probability of opening these cards, so that's something I really would recommend doing. But if it comes to the point where you're under Anti-Spell Fragrance or maybe even like Imperial Order and you really can't out it, just remember that you also have, you know, monster effects that can destroy cards, again, like Zodiac Trident, so that's another way to out these cards as well. It can be very simple to out them, but Anti-Spell Fragrance coupled with, you know, something like a Trident or, you know, many more opposing back row can sometimes be very hard to play against. So sometimes just having the Twin Twister can really be all you need to be able to play through your opponent's cards and help take control of the game. One other way I would recommend playing around it is that if your hand isn't really comprised of spell cards, you could Twin Twister but chain to destroy all of your opponent's back row other than the Anti-Spell Fragrance, because if you can pretty much take control of the board and leave the Anti-Spell Fragrance on your opponent's field, then if they draw into any spell cards, they're not going to be able to use them and help them regain control of the board themselves. So you can basically turn their own Anti-Spell Fragrance against them. Now for the number 4 trap to avoid, it's going to be Horn of Heaven. Now Horn of Heaven hasn't really seen a lot of play. It's popped up in a few side decks, but I feel it's very important to discuss because, especially since now with the Zodiac deck in particular, they're able to leave so many extra Zodiac monsters on the board. Horn of Heaven can be a card that might be misread for something like Enemy Controller, and because Horn of Heaven can negate summons, that's actually huge because it can stop stuff like your normal summon and things like that without having to waste their Solemn Warnings. So Horn of Heaven can be a very difficult card to play around because unless you see that your opponent might have like an extra monster that they might be saving for an enemy controller or something like that, Horn of Heaven's just a card that you can play right into without really being able to do anything about it. So this is a card that really, if you have the removal to pop it before you go all in with your normal summon or your big plays, I would highly recommend doing that. But otherwise, if you feel like they might have something like a Horn of Heaven, you could always play a less powerful option first to try to bait out the Horn of Heaven. Your opponent might, you know, be trigger happy and just want to negate the first thing that pops on the field, which is common when you have something as powerful as Horn of Heaven at your disposal. So maybe you can force them to get rid of something you don't really care about. You got rid of the Horn of Heaven, and then on your next turn, you can go off with your more powerful play, knowing that the Horn of Heaven is no longer on the field. Also keep in mind that they do need to tribute one monster to activate Horn of Heaven, so if you have stuff like your board wipes, like Dark Hole, Regeki, anything like that, you can completely wipe their board of monsters, and then their Horn of Heaven is going to be a dead card in their back row. Now, last but not least, for the number 5 card on this list, it's going to be Starlight Road. Now, Starlight Road is a card that always manages to take people by surprise, and I feel like because we're going into a very pure Zodiac-centric event, I feel like Twin Twisters is going to become very popular again, and anytime Twin Twisters is being played in mass, Starlight Road always seems to peek its head in, and the reason for that is because Twin Twisters is the prime fodder to basically fuel a perfectly timed Starlight Road. So the biggest way you can play around a card like Starlight Road is to simply just not use Twin Twisters at a time that they can activate Starlight Road. So the best time would be during your opponent's end phase if they just set some back row. If you flip your set Twin Twister from the turn before and pop their back row, they're not going to be able to use the Starlight Road if they just set it that turn, so that's a way to quickly shut that off. But as long as you have cards that aren't going to be destroying multiple cards on the field, so like your board wipes, Twin Twister, anything that is just pure mass removal, as long as you're very cautious with how you use those cards, then you won't play into Starlight Road, you won't be facing down a Stardust Dragon, and your life is not going to be a living hell because of it. But guys, that's it for my top 5 traps to avoid at the North American WCQ. Let me know down in the comments what your guys' thoughts are on what traps you might see and anything else you might want to avoid going into this event, because I'd really love to hear your thoughts of how we can better prepare for this tournament. So guys, thank you so much for watching the video. Be sure to like the video as always, subscribe to the channel for more amazing Yu-Gi-Oh content, and if you found this video helpful, consider backing me on Patreon, because just by pledging only $1 a month, you're investing in my ability to continue bringing you amazing Yu-Gi-Oh content. So thanks so much again, and we'll see you next time.